good afternoon from good afternoon from Hong Kong. Maybe morning in some other places. So thank you all for coming to this Hong Kong U Science Distinguished Lecture. We have the first talk from Professor Sir Richard Catlow, particularly on the science stream. We have an impact stream as well. So this is the first one on science stream. And to enhance the exchange and activity, we also have a distinguished panelists. I'll just say the name, you see it on screen. We have Professor Huiming Chen, who's an academician of the Chinese Academy of Sciences from Tsinghua University. Professor Alex Jurisic from Hong Kong U Physics. Alex is also our Dean, Deputy Dean for Research, our Vesting Research. Professor Hongzhe Sun from Hong Kong U Chemistry. Hongzhe is also our Director of Research Division and Chemistry. Dr. Junyao Tang, Hong Kong U Chemistry. Professor Junwang Tang as our guest panelist from University College London, Chemical Engineering. Professor Edmund Chief, Hong Kong U Chemistry. Professor Lianzhou Wang from the University of Queensland, and of course Professor Vivian Yam, also another our academician of Chinese Academy of Sciences, amongst many recognitions from Hong Kong U Chemistry, and Professor Wang Yao from Hong Kong U Physics. Of course, this lecture series is going to become available under the support of Hong Kong U Science faculty. I'm pleased to introduce our Dean, Professor Matthew Evans, to actually say a few words of welcome and introduce our guest speaker formally. Matthew, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Dear teachers, students, and guests, welcome to the Faculty of Science Distinguished Lecture entitled Structure, Dynamics, and Reactivity in Catalytic Systems and Energy Materials. I'm Matthew Evans. I'm Dean of Science and Professor of Ecology and Biodiversity here at the University of Hong Kong. The concerted use of synchrotron, neutron, and modeling techniques has proved to be a powerful approach in probing catalytic structures and processes at the molecular level. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Sir Richard Catlow, today. Professor Catlow, MAE, FLSW, FRS, is a professor of chemistry at both University College London and Cardiff University. Sir Richard's research program is based on the development and application of computational techniques used in direct conjunction with experiment in probing the properties of complex materials. This is a key area of contemporary physical sciences whose importance is recognized worldwide. He has played a leading role in developing the field both in the UK and internationally. His program comprises the study of energy materials, catalysis, nanochemistry, and surface chemistry. His work has also exploited the synergy between computation and experiment using synchrotron radiation and neutron scattering methods, especially in catalytic science. The work he has published now comprises about 1,100 papers, book chapters, and reviews, and has received over 50,000 citations with an H-index of 107. Sir Richard has contributed extensively to the UK and international scientific community. He has organised over 80 conferences worldwide during his career. He serves on the Council of the Royal Society and was appointed Foreign Secretary and Vice President of the Society from December 2016. He has contributed extensively to UK and international research funding, peer review bodies, and to journal editorial boards. In 2014, he chaired the Chemistry Committee of the UK Research Excellence Framework. In 2017, he was elected co-chair of the Inter-Academy Partnership for Policy, a worldwide alliance of over 130 space academies. In a moment, Sir Richard will illustrate the approach he takes by recent applications to a range of systems, including hydrocarbon dynamics and reactivity in microporous catalysts, structural and electronic properties of nano-particulate catalysts, and including photocatalysts, carbon dioxide and methane activation on oxide and carbide catalysts, the electronic structure of photoactive oxides, and how this powerful combination of techniques might be applied more widely in catalytic science. And so without further ado, I now pass the floor to Professor Sir Richard Catlow.
Thank you, Professor Mathiamas. So, Richard, the floor is, the screen is yours. Okay, when you're ready. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I'll just try and share the screen. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share some of the science we've been doing for the last few years with you. And as Matthew said in his kind introduction, the talk will focus on using a combination of experimental and computational techniques in understanding structure dynamics and reactivity of catalytic, and if I have time, energy systems. And we'll have four main themes, if I have time. The first will concentrate on nano-particulate catalysts, where I think our team has made a lot of progress in recent years. Then I'll highlight recent work on hydrocarbon dynamics in microporous catalysts, a really fascinating area, and one where neutron spectroscopy has made over recent years a very major contribution. We'll then look at the mechanisms of activation of key small molecules, hydrogen, CO2, and nitrogen on oxide and nitride surfaces. And if I have time at the end, I'll perhaps move a little bit more to materials physics and talk about our work on electronic structure in wide gap semiconductors. And as I said, we use a multi-technique approach combining spectroscopy, microscopy, and modeling techniques. So let me move on to my first theme, which is the application of these combined computational and experimental techniques to the properties of nanoparticulate catalysts. And we'll look briefly at four main systems. The first are alloy nanoparticles for photocatalysis, I think a very significant development in recent years. Then restructuring of nanoparticles during operation, really significant for understanding catalytic systems. Then recent work that's identified, in fact, single cation active sites in the key industrial catalyst. And finally, I'll just show briefly some work that allows us to correlate structure with product distribution. Well, moving on to the first example, this is again joint experimental work undertaken a few years ago with my team then at UCL, Andrew Logsdale, Chris Downing, collaborating with experimentalists both in Cardiff and in Lehigh University and in Aarhus University in Denmark. And it concerned optimizing the photocatalytic hydrogen production using gold palladium nanoparticles, alloy nanoparticles. Just a few introductory words about hydrogen production via photocatalysis. We quite rightly think of hydrogen as a green fuel, but then if we take a step back, we have to note that currently only perhaps 5 to 10% of commercial hydrogen comes from renewable sources, mainly actually from water electrolysis. Most hydrogen, most commercial hydrogen, essentially is produced by reforming of methane. So it's actually produced from fossil fuels. So that's quite a major issue. Electrolysis may become competitive, but materials used contain toxic elements. And for now, for well over 40 years, there has been intensive research on photocatalytic conversion, essentially photocatalytic generation of hydrogen, and a lot of groups around the world working on this field. Now, one strategy you use to improve photocatalytic performance is the use of photocatalysts, and that's kind of illustrated in this diagram. So this has a dye-sensitized titania photoactive material, so you're generating your holes and electrons in the TiO2, and of course it's of key importance to try and maximize the lifetime by separating holes from electrons. So the role of the co-catalyst, which is a metal nanoparticle on the surface of the TiO2, essentially is to trap electrons from the conduction band of the TiO2, and once the electrons are on the nanoparticle, they can effect reduction of the hydrogen. Now, looking at this diagram, you can see there are perhaps two key, well, there are important rate processes. There is the rate at which the electrons are transferred, from the TiO2 to the nano-catalyst, co-catalyst. Then there is the rate at which they're transferred back. And then, of course, then there is going to be the rate at which the electrons on the nanoparticle effect reduction of the hydrogen. Now, these catalysts work with gold nanoparticles on TiO2. Well, what was found out in this very nice experimental work, we weren't involved in the experiment, but it was found you could improve the photocatalytic performance by alloying the gold with palladium. And so we wanted to understand why. And you can see this diagram already refers to these key rate processes. It refers to what we call K-rev, that is the rate at which electrons, once they've been transferred to the nanoparticle, return back to the conduction band of the TiO2. And then there is K-red, K-reduction, the rate at which electrons on the nanoparticle effect reduction, the water to form hydrogen, water or other hydrogen-containing material. Now, this nice experimental work was able to get a grip on both K-reduce and K-reverse. They obtained the kinetics of trapped electrons effecting reduction by investigating methylene blue photoreduction. So that gave them a handle on K-reduction, and the K-reverse was monitored essentially by the background absorption of the TiO2. And they got some very interesting results. First, actually, you can see this microscopy, beautiful electron microscopy, carried out by the Lehigh group with atomic resolution. And you can see that some of these nanoparticles have a core shell structure. But if you can see them, let's just focus on the plots at the bottom. You'll see those green lines which vary. The green lines are measuring the K reverse, the rate at which electrons, once they're on the nanoparticle, are transferred back to the TiO2. And you see those decrease rapidly as you increase the proportion of palladium in the nanoparticle. So one of the key roles, or the key role of the alloying, essentially is to stabilize the electrons on the nanoparticle. If you look at the red features there in those graphs, those refer to these core shell systems where you get segregation of one of the metals to the surface. And you see that the system with a palladium shell around a gold core is particularly effective. So that's experiment. Now let's just briefly see where the calculations come in. The calculations were carried out using standard density functional theory. That's good quality quantum mechanical calculations to map out the electron distribution in these nanoparticles. What do you see on the right there is a density of states plot. And there's one important lesson there. If you look at the pure gold, well, let me take a step back. There is a key region in the density of states plot that is between the conduction band minimum on the TiO2, that's the red dotted line, and the Fermi level on the nanoparticle, that's the black dotted line. And what you want is there to be appreciable density of states in that region so that they can accept the electrons from the conduction band. You see that the density of states for gold is very low in that region. For palladium, the density of states is much higher. So we see palladium is more, when you include palladium, you introduce density of states in this key region to accept the electrons. So we understand, we'll begin to get some understanding of why the alloying is important. And then we get more insight when we look at the electron density distributions displayed graphically on the graphics on the left-hand side of the screen. And the blue regions indicate, or the deep blue regions, the regions of high electron density. And you see for the palladium shell gold core system, electron density is concentrated on a few specific apical atoms. And what we suggest is that when you concentrate the electron density on those atoms, it increases the efficacy of the reduction process. So we've learned here that you can enhance the photocatalytic performance by this alloying. And secondly, we've got insights from the computational work as to why the alloying is effective. Well, let me move on quickly to my second example. This is purely experimental work, in fact, work led by Emma Gibson, who is a postdoc in the Catalysis Hub, where a lot of this work, Catalysis Hub, based on the Harwell Science and Innovation Campus in the UK, and where a lot of this work was carried out. And Emma Gibson, Peter Wells very much led this work. And what they were doing was combining X-ray spectroscopy using the synchrotron radiation source at the UK Diamond Light source on the Harwell campus. They were combining that with infrared drifts spectroscopy. The X-ray spectroscopy, I can't go into detail, that gives you information on local structure and on oxidation state, and it's element specific. The infrared spectroscopy allows you to monitor the surface processes. Now, this is the kit that they built together with the staff, the beamline scientists on the Diamond Light source. It's implemented on beamline 18 on the Diamond Light source, and you can measure infrared as you're measuring your X-ray spectroscopy. And the case study we took again was our friend, the gold palladium nanoparticle, and they wanted to monitor how the structure changes during the catalytic process affected by this nanoparticle system. So it was gold palladium supported on alumina, and they monitored its changes during CO oxidation. And they put together evidence from looking at the palladium and gold edges, the X-ray spectroscopic data, which allows you to learn the local structure around both the palladium and the gold. And they were monitored the IR spectroscopy of CO on the surface of the nanoparticle. Now, it's a complicated story and described in detail in this paper published 5 years ago in Chemistry and Materials. What I'm doing here is just summarizing graphically what we learned from this work. What we learned was that the initial state of the catalyst is as shown in the graphics A there. It has oxygen on the surface, a kind of palladium oxide layer. It has a gold-rich core and a gold palladium alloy exterior. You could deduce all that from the combination of the X-ray spectroscopy with the infrared, which was the infrared telling you what was happening on the surface. Now, what you find is that during the operation of the catalytic operation, it reconstructs. You lose the oxygen on the surface, that oxidizes CO to CO2, and the particle reconstructs by all the gold burying itself in the core, ending up with what you're seeing in graphics D. So it really is a major reconstruction. It will have implications for the reactivity, for the changes in the reactivity during the operation of the catalyst. So let me go on to my, well, just before I move on, just emphasize that our work has emphasized how, as it were, dynamic these nanoparticles are. They will rapidly reconstruct. Here is some molecular dynamics, so this is computational, on a gold-silver nanoparticle, and even at relatively low temperatures, this MD work suggests that the particle will quite rapidly reconstruct. So that's the second thing we've learned. We've learned that these nanoparticles are not static, they're very dynamic entities. Now let me move on to my third example. This is work on, in fact, what is now an important industrial catalyst. I should say this work very much led by my colleague Graham Hutchings, who is a pioneer in the use of gold in catalytic science and technology. And he discovered, many years ago, that gold, what we thought were nanoparticles supported on a carbon catalyst, graphite catalyst, was effective for this important process of acetylene hydrochlorination. Acetylene hydrochlorination essentially makes vinyl chloride, which you then use to make polyvinyl chlorides. Now, if you look at the catalytic process that has been widely used, it was based on mercury-based catalysts, which obviously gives rise to environmental problems. The catalytic technology in fact, developed by Johnson Matthey, but using Graham Hutchings' pioneering work, is now actually industrial production in several areas of China, and is obviously environmentally far preferable. But we wanted to look at the fundamentals here, and that is what are the catalytic active sites? Because it had been very widely assumed, quite reasonably, that the catalytic species are gold nanoparticles. Well, again, we probed this using X-ray spectroscopy on beamline 18, diamond light source. Here is the publication from 3 years ago, fairly standard in situ X-ray spectroscopy. Now, again, it's a complicated story, so I'll just summarize it very briefly. What we're seeing here is essentially the gold absorption edge for this catalyst, first as you start the catalytic process. And it's a time-resolved spectrum. And after about 50 minutes, the system has settled down and it's then operating catalytically. So we then analyze the spectrum when the catalyst is actually in operation. And what we find is something quite remarkable. Here we've got the Fourier transform of the spectrum. And what you see in red there is the kind of Fourier transform you'd expect if you had gold nanoparticles, because you would see in the Fourier transform features corresponding to gold-gold separations in the nanoparticle. Those are completely absent in the spectrum that you actually observe experimentally, which is the one in green. And what that peak you see, you can assign to gold interacting with a chloride ion. So in fact, what you have is not nanoparticles. When the catalyst is operating, you have got single gold cations. And in fact, complementary computational work showed that both gold, Aurous gold, gold plus, and gold 3 plus, auric gold, could affect this catalytic process. Right, and then just finally, only one slide here, the recent work published in Nature Catalysis, which really shows structure-activity relationship. This again is a significant catalytic process. It's the oxidation of ammonia to nitrogen over a palladium catalyst supported on alumina. And by carrying out in situ spectroscopy coupled to mass spectrometric analysis, you're able to show that if the surface of the palladium is what we think is a kind of palladium nitride compound, you get selectivity to nitrogen. If the surface is partially oxidized, that's the graphics in the middle, you get selectivity towards nitrous oxide. You can see that in the mass spec analysis. And if you've got a layer of palladium oxide on the surface, you get selectivity towards nitric oxide. So really what's happening on the surface is absolutely critically important. Now let me just now give, a final quick example of recent work. And I should say most of the credit of this work goes to Alex Greenaway, Andy Beale and colleagues. And what we're doing here is we're looking at copper-based small pore zeolites for denox catalysis, using this very interesting technique of modulation excitation spectroscopy. And this, of course, is very relevant industrially. We're looking, in fact, at commercial catalysts. This is graphics of emission control systems for heavy duty transport, where you have this catalytic system that includes an oxidation catalyst, then there's a particulate filter. But we're going to focus on the third component of this, and that is the selective catalytic reductor, which is there to remove nitrogen oxides from the exhaust. And it's now been known for several years that a pretty effective catalyst for carrying this out is this microporous zeolite cadazide. And it catalyzes the chemistry that's summarized here. That is, the ammonia reacts with nitrogen oxides and oxygen to form nitrogen. So it removes this toxic NOx. And the catalyst is a copper exchange system. So the copper ions are the active site. But we want to understand the catalytic process. Now, again, you can interrogate this experimentally. And so I do want to give the credit for this work to Andy Beale, Alex Greenaway and colleagues, again working in the Catalysis Hub on the Harwell Science and Innovation Campus. This is a kind of schematic of the kind of techniques they use. They can do X-ray spectroscopy, XRFs. At the same time, they can do diffraction, and simultaneously, they can monitor the essentially exhaust of the catalytic process by mass spectrometry. So it's a really impressive experimental setup that they and others have developed. Now, what is the nature of the active copper species? Still a matter of debate. This is, let me just go back. You can see the basic carbazite structures. It's got 6 rings and 8 rings, and the copper is associated with those. The diffraction data they obtain indicates that the copper migrates as the temperature rises from the 8 ring to the 6 ring. But in fact, the question of the location of the copper when it's most active is still a matter of debate. But this work aimed to actually try and understand, get some handle on the mechanism of the catalytic reaction. We need to understand the materials and we need to understand the catalytic process. We need to understand what are the nature of some of the catalytic intermediates. Now that is difficult because they're only short-lived in the reaction pathway. But you can overcome that using this very interesting technique of modulation excitation spectroscopy. This is a pulsed experimental technique. So you pulse the reactants into the experimental setup and measure the spectrum. And then the demodulation of this time-resolved spectra moves all the static features and enhances the features that are changing when you pulse the reactants in. So it allows you to identify intermediates. So I say these series of time-resolved spectra with good signal to noise, you can demodulate them using this phase-sensitive detection. So just let me, essentially all you really do is a sort of Fourier transform. You apply this modulation summarized in the equation there, and the time-resolved spectra, the multiplier bound is sine function of the same frequency as the stimulation, and that picks out the species in the spectrum that are changing with the stimulation. So it picks out the active sites and the intermediates in the catalytic process. Now there's a lot of data here, I'll just show some of it. This is the full demodulated spectrum, and it's only now containing features which respond at the same frequency as the stimuli. And then you look at various regions in the spectrum, you can pick out this copper CO2 plus OH species, which we think it plays a key role in the catalysis. You can see acid sites, you can see absorbed ammonia, then further other regions in the spectrum, you can see NO2, you can see NO, and then you can start to try and piece together a catalytic cycle. Now we haven't got all the steps in this catalytic process, but you can see some of the key ones that have been identified by this experimental work. And particularly this copper hydroxide species. And in fact, then you can see the copper nitrate species that contains many similarities to a mechanistic cycle proposed in this nice paper by Janssens a few years ago. There's the cycle that he proposed. And in a complementary study, we're looking at that cycle in great detail using quantum mechanical modeling techniques. But essentially what we've done here is we've been able to get a handle on some of the key intermediates, the role as an active site of this copper hydroxide species. We've picked up some of the intermediates. Further work is needed, particularly using computational techniques to assign some of the unknown species in the spectrum. Okay, let me now move on quickly to the second theme, and that's the application of computational and particularly neutron scattering techniques to hydrocarbon dynamics and reactivity in microporous catalysts. And we've undertaken a lot of work in this area in recent years. I'm just going to, in fact, illustrate one example. Let's just take a step back and look at how neutron techniques, neutron scattering, can be used in studying catalysts and catalytic processes. Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with the use of neutron diffraction in studying structure, particularly when you want to highlight light atoms. And in fact, neutron diffraction has played a significant role in catalytic science. For example, getting structural models for Zorn hydrocarbons in microporous systems. That's well established, but what I want to talk more about is essentially the use of neutron spectroscopy. And we're going to look at two techniques: quasi-elastic neutron scattering, which allows you to monitor the diffusion process, and then vibrational spectroscopy, inelastic neutron scattering, which is especially good for hydrogen-containing molecules, and also has the advantage over infrared and Raman, but it lacks selection rules, so you see all the vibrations. The reference at the bottom is a general review of neutron spectroscopy in catalytic science. First, just a little bit of background on kind of inelastic neutron processes. What we got here is a kind of sort of spectrum, and we're looking at what kind of motions you excite for various neutron exchange energies. So on the left-hand side, you have the elastic peak. The elastic peak is when the neutron interacting with the sample does not exchange energy. Okay, and that, of course, is what you use in neutron diffraction. And most neutrons that are scattered elastically. But you often find that the elastic peak has these wings to it, and that's what is called a quasi-elastic region. And what is going on there is that the neutron is exchanging very small amounts of energy with translational motion of the molecules. So it's giving a small amount of energy or losing a small amount of energy to translational motions of the molecules. And due to fantastic theoretical work carried out by Roger Elliott and others many years ago, we can analyze this quasi-elastic region to give information on diffusion. Now, if we go a bit deeper into the energy exchange, we can start to excite rotational motion. If we go even further, more deeply, we can start to, of course, excite phonons, cooperative vibrations in solids. And of course, that's a big area of condensed matter physics. Most of what we know, or a lot of what we know experimentally about lattice dynamics in solids comes from neutron scattering. Go even more deeply, you can excite essentially molecular vibrations, or the optic modes. We'll want to talk more about that. They're even more deeper, you can excite electronic transitions, and of course, that's a kind of completely separate area. But we're going to kind of concentrate on the blue and the red, a quasi-elastic region, which gives you information on essentially molecular dynamics and allows you to get data on diffusion, and inelastic, the red part, where you're exciting vibrational modes. Now, we can carry out these experiments using the really excellent facilities of the UK neutron and muon source, the ICIS facility on the Harwell Science and Innovation Campus. And here's an aerial view. The big circular feature you see there, that's the diamond light source. That's where the work I was talking about a few minutes ago was undertaken. In the foreground, the region where you can see the kind of blue and white building, that is where we house the ICIS neutron source. And it's what we call the spallation source, not a reactor source. You produce the neutrons by bombarding a heavy metal target with high energy protons. It was developed in the 1980s, but still a state-of-the-art facility. I'm just going to give you one illustration, and that is on the methoxylation of zeolites. This is a very widely studied process, and the work here was very much led by my colleague, then a PhD student, Alex O'Malley, now a faculty member at the University of Bath in the UK. And we studied two zeolites, the one on the left, HZSM5, that is used as what we call a methanol to gasoline catalyst. The one on the right is a wonderful catalyst for catalytic cracking, but it doesn't work as a hydrocarbon synthesis catalyst. So here, in fact, it's just the reference to the paper, the first paper, there have been several since, that summarize the work that I'm going to describe. So just a little bit of background, methanol to hydrocarbons. This is an intensively studied topic in catalytic science. In fact, this catalysis was first developed, I think, in the late 1970s, but with recent changes in hydrocarbon feedstocks, it's become very, very topical again. So you can feed methanol into this active zeolite, ZSM5, and it will convert the methanol into hydrocarbons in the gasoline range. The chemistry is very complicated, and the study of pretty intensive work around the world. We're just going to concentrate on the first step, which has long been thought to be fairly conventional chemistry. Essentially, you methylate one of the oxygens of the framework. You can see in the graphics, you have a Bronsted acid site. This is an acid catalyst, and it does rather conventional kind of organic chemistry. And you have an SN2 reaction in which one of the oxygens in the framework reacts with the methanol, and you get a surface methoxy. Now, that's been discussed in the literature, but no really absolutely direct evidence. Anyway, this work, as I said, looked at these two catalysts, HZSM5, there's graphics of it, a routine methanol to gasoline catalyst, and zeolite Y, inactive as an MTG catalyst, but of course, hugely commercially important as a cracking catalyst. These are aluminum silicates with low concentrations of aluminium. We ensure that they have the same silicon to aluminium ratio. We loaded them with methanol, and we carried out QENs to look at methanol diffusion and inelastic neutron spectroscopy to monitor the vibrational spectroscopy of the methanol. Well, let me just look quickly at the spectrum there, which you can see of the zeolite Y, which is at the top. And the green is essentially a methanol reference spectrum. So that's just methanol before you load it into the zeolite. Then you load the methanol into the zeolite, and you see that most of the features, in fact, all the features are still there. There's a feature that you assign to OH deformation mode. That has been blurred a bit, but it's still there. And that is almost certainly because the methanol is hydrogen bonding to the Bronsted site in the zeolite. And there's separate evidence that methanol forms hydrogen bonds with these Bronsted sites. But the methanol is still intact. Now you look at the spectrum lower down of the ZSM5, and what you find is that the feature in that OH region around 700, 750 has completely disappeared. Now, what is happening? The most obvious explanation is that kind of methanol isn't there any longer as a methanol molecule. The CH3 species are still there, the CH stretch and the CH bend. The most obvious explanation is that the methanol has reacted and formed this surface methoxy group. So that's what you find from the INS. You then do your QENs, and here is the QENs data. Now at the top you have the ZSM5. And what we're showing, of course, is you do get some broadening of the elastic peak due to purely instrumental factors. And you know, you can predict what those instrumental factors are. And if you look at the ZSM5 spectrum, it is in fact attributable entirely, the broadening, to instrumental factors. There is no QENs. And that just at the qualitative level indicates that there's no diffusion, which is consistent with the fact that it's reacted and the CH3 group is now bonded to the zeolite. If you look at the zeolite Y, you can see those wings to the elastic peak. The red dotted line there is, again, that's what you'd expect from instrumental broadening. You see those wings, and those wings indicate quens. So in the zeolite Y, the methanol is still diffusing. It probably diffuses slowly. We've since done more detailed analysis because it's the hydrogen bonding, but the methanol is still there and it's diffusing. So this reinforces the deductions we've made from the inelastic neutron scattering, the vibrational spectroscopy. Now the final stage, the final step, is to carry out calculations of the vibrational frequency. You can use this again using standard density functional theory, using the CASTEP code, very good code for these kind of calculations. Calculate vibrational frequencies, that's what, and then you obtain what you see in green there. You can compare it with the experimental data. Of course, the calculations give a rather more tidy spectrum, but in fact, the two really are very similar. And so that I think is verifying that you do have this, essentially this methoxy species that is illustrated in the graphics. So what we've shown is that there is methanol conversion to framework methoxy species, even observed at room temperature. That in some was a surprise. That it takes place in this zeolite ZSM5, which is the active catalyst. You don't observe it in zeolite Y. They both have the same silicon aluminium ratio, so the activity of the ZSM5 is related to the framework topology. Right, well, let me move on rather quickly as time's running out to my third theme, and that's reactivity on oxide and nitride surfaces. And we're going to look at the reactions of these key small molecules: hydrogen, CO2, methane activation, and nitrogen activation. Here are some of the key references. Much of this work was being carried out using this technique summarized here, what we call QMMM, quantum mechanical molecular mechanical methods. This is a technique that's been around, or an approach that's been around for a long time. It's very widely used in computational molecular biology. But we have been very active in developing these techniques for applications in catalysis. The idea is simple. You embed a quantum mechanical region that essentially encompasses the region where, in this case, the catalysis is taking place. You embed that in a more approximate description using interatomic potentials of the more distant regions. You have to have an interface region between them. And this allows you to do high quality calculations on the region of interest, the region where the catalysis is taking place. Now, it's rather simple to present the technique in that way. Actually developing these methods so that they're reliable is pretty demanding. But this ChemShell package developed by, originally by Sherwood, now by Tom Keel at the Daresbury Lab in the UK. We've collaborated with them on the developments. Allows you to do these calculations very effectively, both for solid state applications, heterogeneous catalysis, and for biocatalysis as well. We're going to look briefly at methanol synthesis. This is an absolutely classic area of catalytic science. And so, best part of 60 years, the commercial catalyst originally developed at ICI in the UK has been this copper zinc oxide catalyst. And what that does, essentially, it converts syngas, mixture of CO and hydrogen, into methanol. And this is a large-scale industrial process. Now, in work a long time ago, 20 years ago, we studied some of the basic aspects of the mechanism here. We were studying the process initially just on the surface of zinc oxide, and what we identified as the key process were capture of CO2, which you see in the graphics, dissociation of hydrogen, capture of the CO2 at trapped electron sites on the surface, activates the CO2 molecules, which then react with hydrogen, and eventually you get methanol formation. And then you oxidize in the final step CO to CO2. So it's quite interesting. Although this process affects conversion of CO and hydrogen to syngas, it's all done by the intermediary of carbon dioxide. And there's actually very good experimental evidence going back 20, 30 years to support, going back 30, 40 years to support that. This is a mechanistic cycle that we're now investigating in more detail, but the basic aspects we believe are correct. I just want to look very briefly at two key processes, and that is the hydrogen dissociation and the CO2 activation. Now, zinc oxide is an N-type semiconductor, so there are trapped electrons on the surface. Hydrogen can approach that surface. The trapped electron is the big blue feature indicated on this graphics. It reacts with hydrogen. This is computationally deduced to form an H2 minus ion. That is a well-known species. You can detect it spectroscopically. The H2 minus then decomposes into a hydride that bonds to a zinc and a hydrogen atom over the surface. The hydrogen atom then donates its electron back to the surface and the proton bonds to an oxygen. So we've effected electrolytic dissociation. The hydrogen, we can compare our calculated desorption energy with experimental data from Bowker's group from nearly 40 years ago. There is very good agreement between calculations and experiment. Let me now just look at one of my favorites, and that's CO2 activation. Now, there's been a change here in the kind of color coding. We're looking at spin densities, and the yellow feature there, that's the spin density due to a trapped electron on the surface of zinc oxide. And what we're doing is we're bringing a CO2 molecule down over there, and what you can see is the electron goes from the surface into the anti-bonding orbitals of the CO2, and the CO2 bends over, and you're making an activated CO2 minus molecule. That's absolutely key process in the catalysis, because this activated molecule can then react with hydrogen. And again, we can make comparisons between calculated and experimental energies of desorption. Again, very nice data from Mike Bowker's group from many years ago. So we've looked at these very basic processes here: hydrogen dissociation, CO2 activation, key processes in a lot of catalytic areas. We take this work much further. I can really just mention there's a recent paper coming out in Journal of Materials Chemistry that has developed detailed models for copper species on zinc oxide. And we're now actively looking at how these copper nanoparticles on the surface of zinc oxide activate CO2. We think that the key processes take place at the interfacial sites between, on the bottom right-hand side, between the nanoparticle and the CO2. Right, let me just take you my third example. This is work we've been carrying out for many years in collaboration with Johnson Matthey on the use of yttriostabilized zirconia, very widely used material in electrochemistry and in catalysis. And what this will do is effect the catalytic partial oxidation of methane to syngas, to CO and hydrogen. And a lot of discussion in the literature about the mechanisms involved here. We just, in this work, wanted to understand the first step. How do you activate methane? Again, that's a big challenge in catalysis. Methane is a pretty inert molecule with strong CH bonds. How do you activate it? Well, this catalyst does it. And what we think happens is, first, you absorb on the surface oxygen molecule. You transfer a small amount of electron density to that oxygen molecule. So that now is, as it were, your activated site, and then you bring your methane molecule down over this surface where this oxygen molecule is, has been trapped. And the mechanism, you can see, it's probably best to focus on the bottom right-hand side. And what we do is really quite interesting. You transfer the hydrogen not to the oxygen molecule, you transfer the hydrogen from the methane to a surface oxygen, but then the electron from the hydrogen goes into the anti-bonding orbitals of the oxygen to make a superoxide ion. So the kind of oxygen is there as almost a spectator to receive this electron, and you get this hydroxylated surface. And there's some indirect experiment to support that. Now, we're doing a lot more work on the later stages of this reaction. Just, I think, finally, I did want to highlight our work on ammonia synthesis. This is work carried out by Konstantinos and Alipur Yazdi, but in collaboration with the experimental group of Justin Hargreaves. And this, again, of course, is a very, very topical area in current catalytic science. Synthesis of ammonia is an absolutely key process. In fact, there is data to show that the nutrition of half the world's population is dependent upon ammonia catalytically synthesized from nitrogen and hydrogen. It's an exothermic reaction, but it's a slow reaction, so you need moderate temperature and you need high pressure. And of course, the classic catalysis, still the industrial process, is potassium oxide promoted iron, which is the Haber-Bosch process, is one of the great breakthroughs in the early part of the last century in catalytic science. But it's a very energy intensive process, and we want to find a catalyst that works at lower energy. This is the Haber-Bosch process. The chemistry, there's a lot of evidence now from both experiment and computation. The mechanism is fairly simple, but the key process is it involves dissociation of nitrogen, which of course is a very strong bond. And once you've dissociated the nitrogen, you can hydrogenate it. Now, Hargreaves' group, and there are others around the world, have been investigating metal nitride catalysts. In particular, this cobalt molybdenum nitrogen system proves to be quite a good catalyst for this chemistry. And we studied this computationally, and what we found was that it seems to be that there's a different mechanism, which we try and illustrate here. This cobalt molybdenum nitrogen rather readily loses nitrogen, so you can create nitrogen vacancies on the surface. But then those nitrogen vacancies can trap molecular nitrogen. And once they've trapped the molecular nitrogen, you can start to hydrogenate that nitrogen without dissociation. And that is, we think, the key factor making this an effective catalyst, that it's a non-dissociative mechanism. And this is now really the thrust of our current and future work on ammonia synthesis, and that is to find even more effective catalysts that work by a non-dissociative mechanism. You can do a whole range of catalytic cycles. In fact, you can show both the Langmuir-Hinshelwood and Ely-Rideal mechanisms could be operative for these systems. But the main point I wanted to stress is that this mechanism can occur under milder conditions because it involves a non-dissociative process. And there's a kind of short review, well, no, there's a publication there that summarizes some of this work. Now, I think I've run out of time, so I probably should omit my fourth theme. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk about it. It's a more materials physics one, where we were able to elucidate the limits to p-type doping of these key materials, zinc oxide and gallium nitride. But I've overused my time, so I'm just going to, sorry about this, I'm going to conclude by just thanking the people who've allowed this work to go ahead. People who've done the computation are at the top. I've tried to mention them as they've gone along. I should mention that a lot of the work on the QMMM methods has been led by Alexei Sokol. Alex and Marley did a great deal of work on the neutrons, but I've also mentioned Justin Hargreaves for the work on ammonia synthesis. A great deal of work has used the facilities and the labs of the UK Catalysis Hub. That is a UK national network of catalytic scientists with a physical hub based on the Harwell campus, where I spend a lot of my time. And we've had funding for quite a lot of this work from and support from Johnson Matthey. So I'll conclude at this point. I apologize if I've overrun. I hope I really have shown you how, with this combination of experiment with computation, you can get to grips with these complex processes in catalytic systems. So thank you very much for listening. Great.
Thank you very much, Professor Catlow, for very, very informative and stimulating talk, particularly under the theme of computational simulations in combination with some really modern analytical techniques. We can really gain very, very fundamental insights into molecular interactions for the formation of new structures, particularly with greater detail and certainty. I think the very good examples about the tools used, the combination of tools used for the work, and also the way of tailoring through the computer, understanding the complex processes of molecular interactions in determining or achieving very selective chemicals at the end. I think it's a great detail. And also I was very pleased to see some of the things we probably would not normally see from just experimental techniques. Things like the surface composition or structural change or reconstruction of the catalysts. The examples of the copper palladium based systems. It's really very, very unique. Without understanding the mechanisms, it will be not possible to achieve certainty and a high level of selectivity. And again, the topic is so widely covered. Some, of course, the very important issues of energy, I would call energy molecules, the small molecules, how they can be tailored to form hydrocarbon fuels and other, or hydrogen clean fuels. These are all very, very important topics, both in terms of energy security and the issues mitigation of climate change, reducing emissions, etc. So, and I know Richard actually have done far more than what he's presented here, but I think this serves as a very good starting point for us to probably engage in some discussions. So I'll open actually, now I'm going to open the floor to panelists, but before that, I actually have already seen some questions posted on the screen. Maybe I'll just read the question to Richard. Richard, to answer this question first. Now, there's one from, actually, someone from the panelists as well. So, in fact, let me show this one. Thank you so much. This one from thanks Professor Catlow. The question is, can the X-ray spectroscopy techniques like with XRFs also be used to probe in situ catalytic changes in, say, palladium or other metal-supported system in a polymer support or fumes?
Yeah, I don't see any reason why not. I mean, obviously, I have to look in more detail, but at least the X-ray spectroscopy now is very sensitive. You can look at low concentrations, so I think that'd be a very interesting possibility.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So there's
no, thanks for the question. It's a really interesting suggestion. Yeah. I'm just looking at the chat. There's a question on methanol to gasoline. What are the key catalyst parameters? Oh,
yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
Again, a very good question. Certainly, one of the key parameters is the silicon to aluminium ratio. Right? Essentially, the concentration of bronzed acid sites. Yeah. That is one key parameter. Another key parameter is the extent of methanol loading. We've shown that recently, that higher methanol loading, in fact, tends to lead to higher reactivity. But it's a good question. But I mean, certainly two, I'm not saying there are only two, but two key parameters are silicon to aluminium ratio and the methanol loading. But again, thanks for the question. Size of the nanoparticles, I need to check that. I mean, there's several nanometers, but I'll check that, and it's probably on the slide, but I don't want to get the slide back up. And I'll let you know. Incidentally, I'm very happy to share these slides with you if people would like them, because they got quite a lot of references.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's some other question. Actually, panelists, you can ask questions directly if you want. Could you just unmute yourself? You can just maybe we'll have a more live exchange. Would you like to do that? Just unmute. You can unmute yourself. Just. Do you want? You have no unmute. Yeah.
I have some questions.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, wonderful talk, and then a lot. So I'm a carbon scientist actually. So I'm working on different types of carbon materials. As you know, some carbon materials such as quantum dots, graphene, nanodiamond are widely used as non-metal catalysts. So my question is it possible to use computational simulation tools to predict the catalytic active site and also to predict the efficient doping heteroatoms to improve the catalytic activities of carbon non-metal catalysts?
Well, I mean, first, I think it's really interesting to hear your work there. I think the short answer to your question is almost certainly yes, that you could use these techniques to probe these catalysts. Obviously, it's not an area of catalysis that I'm familiar with, so I need to look at it in more detail. But I think you could. I mean, for instance, we've done a lot of work recently on, I didn't talk about this, on mechanisms of catalytic processes on transition metal carbides. Now, I can send you some of the references to that if you're interested. So I think the short answer is yes. And I think what would be particularly interesting would be to pursue the second part of your question, to once you've got some kind of a mechanistic understanding, some understanding of active sites, is to try and do predictive modeling as to how mechanisms of reactivity can be modified by doping, which again would be, I think, quite possible. So I mean, really interesting suggestion. I'd be happy kind of offline to follow that up with you.
Thank you very much. So another question is lot of questions, and maybe how do you think? I'm also working on different types of two-dimensional materials. Do you think there are quite a bright future for catalytic applications of two-dimensional materials?
Again, I think the answer is yes. A good friend of mine, Francesc Ilas, who works in the University of Barcelona, has done very interesting work on two-dimensional materials and their applications in catalysis. Again, we would say we haven't worked in that area, but Francesc has. I could put you in touch with him. I think there's some very recently published work. So yeah, I think it's an area that clearly is. I think it's a very interesting area, and one again where the kind of techniques I've been discussing could make a contribution.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Because recently we have discovered a new material is molybdenum silicon nitride. So maybe I think this material could be.
No, please do. Please do.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Hu Mingzhen. Yeah. I saw the question, and Vivian, I saw you actually posed the question. Do you want to ask
okay.
directly?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So very interesting lecture. So thank you very much, Professor Catlow. So actually, I know Graham very well. We attended gold conferences together, but I'm not a catalytic person, so I work on gold materials. But anyway, I want to ask, what are the major challenges you have in your computational studies when you are talking about a very dynamic system when your nanoparticle or alloy or whatever have been sort of undergoing a very dynamic surface reconstruction, and then you have different facets and with different surface energy. So what are the major challenges and difficulties in terms of the computational study?
Well, I mean, first is it is an important, it's again a very good question, and it really is a challenge. It's a challenge more generally that since these nanoparticles reconstruct, we need to understand how the reconstruction influences the catalytic performance. I mean, computation now can, with growth in computer power and techniques, what you can do, and what I think we increasingly need to do, is to use computation to study how reaction mechanisms, how active sites and reaction mechanisms vary with, just as you say, with different facets, so that we get some understanding of how changes in the structure of a nanoparticle will modify the catalytic process. I think that's something now that we can do. In fact, we do have a project currently, well, just getting going in collaboration with the Fritz Haber Institute in Berlin, which is trying to do that, trying to model how reactivity of different varies with the nature of the facet. Yeah, but I mean, thanks for the question. It's a very good one.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because it sort of brings a lot of different sort of interests together. Because I work on discrete gold nanoclusters, so it was sort of like a sort of surface model in a way of the gold surface, and also a lot of times when you talk about the nitrogen, when you have the end-on coordination, the activation, it's also sort of inspire a lot of us, because I'm a molecular chemist, in terms of molecular catalysis, as well as the fact that how the biomimetics sort of enzymes and all that sort of come together. So I think all these would sort of come together and really bring in a lot of crossover and cross-fertilization of ideas. So it's really interesting. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point. I think that this whole area of nitrogen activation, again, we should bring together the kind of work that we're doing on heterogeneous catalysis with the biocatalytic field. And I know my colleague Justin Hargreaves, who is very, very much leading this work in the UK, is very keen on doing that. For instance, that non-dissociative mechanism that I propose, and that is the kind of chemistry that we think takes place in enzymatic nitrogen fixation.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Vivian. So I note Professor Wang Lianzhou has posed a question. Would you like to ask or discuss it online? Professor Wang? No, you're still mute. You're probably still muted.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Guo. I think Professor Catlow already answered my question about the selectivity of the catalyst, the key catalysis selection for hydrocarbon species. I have another one related to, I think, simulation, computation, and the more recently the AI or machine learning has been one of the research focus in the catalytic research community as well. Early this year, there was some Nature paper and reporting the design of some catalyst for photosynthesis, and it looks very exciting. My question is around this. So, Professor Catlow, what's your perspective about the AI assistant, catalyst design for our future, grand challenge? Like if we working on solar water splitting, this is my area, and certainly the efficiency is pretty low at this stage. How we can have some revolutionary catalyst design and it can increase the efficiency, for example, by 1 order of magnitude in the near future?
Well, I mean, it's a great question.
Yes,
I suppose if answer would be, if I knew the answer to that, we would have done it. But I think what you have to try and do is what we and many others do, really, and this is, I think, where computation can help. The computational coupled with experiment of the type I was describing, try to understand the factors that control the efficiency of the catalytic process. And once you understand the factors, then you can try and enhance them. I mean, an example, I think, was that work we did, a few years ago that I described early in the talk on the gold-palladium photocatalyst, well, the gold-palladium co-catalysts for photocatalysis. And then I think we did get some insight from the computation of the key role of this region in the density of states. If you remember, the region between the Fermi level and the conduction band minimum, and that was where you had to try and enhance the density of states in that region. So once you learn that, you then do potentially have a design tool. Now, I don't want to oversell computation, but catalyst design by computation. I think computation does contribute to catalyst design together with experiment. But I think what you can do, I say, is try and do that kind of approach and pick out some of the key features that you think control the catalytic efficiency and then try and enhance them. Yeah. But thanks again for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Professor Wang. And actually, on a similar topic, there are quite a few colleagues working on particularly enhancing photo energy conversion, conversion. So, Junwang, maybe you can comment or question on the game. Yeah.
Thanks. I tried to raise my hand, but I didn't find a sin. And a question. Richard, it's a very nice talk. I think I do listen to many talks from you, but each time you present new information, I really get excited and stimulated by your presentation. I'm quite interested in a few topics you present today, but I think Xiao will not allow me to ask too many questions. When we come back to UCL, have a glass of beer and discuss that one by one.
I look forward to that, John Wang.
Thank you, Richard. The quick one is, again, about the ammonia synthesis. Because you mentioned nitrogen vacancy is very important. And we are working now, move from nitride to the polymer materials, such as carbon nitride. I'm just wondering, is all this type of nitrogen vacancy can work as a nitrogen adsorption set, or only nitride materials work as?
I mean, the answer is, John Wang, I don't know. I mean, the key role of the nitrogen vacancy in this transition metal nitride that we were studying is essentially to trap and activate a nitrogen molecule so that it can then react with hydrogen via this non-dissociative mechanism. Now, maybe C3N can do the same. I don't know. It's a very different system. So I don't know, very different kind of bonding. So I don't know. But I don't think there's anything probably kind of unique to that copper molybdenum nitride system. And in fact, colleague Justin Hargreaves is now trying to look at a whole range of nitride systems, including things like tantalum nitride. And we will follow it up with computation. But maybe, I think the key thing is that you need something that traps and activates molecular nitrogen so that you don't have to dissociate it as you do in Haber-Bosch.
Thank you. That's a very important point for me and for my students, because we are currently working in nitrogen activation, and the results sometimes is very frustrated. So we think that's because
I mean, it may be C3N will do that. I say the key thing is trapping and activation. Nitrogen vacancies do that, but maybe C3N will.
Sure. Can I ask one more question? A quick one.
Yeah.
Quick one. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Thanks, Richard. I think we discussed before about this band gap modeling. By classical theory, you can easily get the band position of semiconductor. But I'm not sure if we can simulate these excited states. Is a band position will change after excitation or same as ground states?
Well, I mean, the answer to that is excited state modeling is much more difficult. Most of these calculations that I've described, or the quantum mechanical calculations based on density functional theory. Density functional theory is, strictly speaking, a ground state theory. But increasingly, there are methods like time-dependent DFT that do allow you to do modeling of excited states. In fact, UCL, we have an expert in that, in Martin Zwangberg in UCL chemistry. So that modeling of excited states is a much more challenging problem, but it is becoming accessible.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Juan. Thanks, Yuan. Still on the photo, conversion process. I'm wondering whether Professor Jurisic, do you have any comments or questions since it's an area of your interest?
Well, actually, I was quite interested in the p-type doping of zinc oxide.
I'm sorry if I didn't. I'll try and summarize in words and not get the slides back up. What the work we've done on gallium nitride and zinc oxide and we show is that essentially holes are thermodynamically unstable in both of those systems, because what will happen, just a whole state, it is let's take zinc oxide, it is thermodynamically favorable for a hole essentially for the zinc oxide to lose oxygen. Hole is a positively starred species, to lose oxygen and be oxygen to the atmosphere and create an oxygen vacancy. That is a thermodynamically favorable process. Now, similarly in gallium nitride, that essentially holes in gallium nitride are thermodynamically unstable. Look, I'll tell you what, I will try. Can I share the screen again just for a moment?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay, I'll try and do that. I'm sorry about, let's do it properly this time. Has that worked?
No, but never mind. Let me just elaborate.
Okay, sorry about that. But essentially, I can send you the publications. But the key thing is that the holes are thermodynamically unstable with respect to the formation of, in zinc oxide, oxygen vacancies, and in gallium nitride, nitrogen vacancies. So you either have to stabilize them kinetically some way, or you have to stabilize them by, say, interaction with dopant ions. But they are thermodynamically unstable, and that's absolutely consistent with the observation that, in fact, both zinc oxide and gallium nitride are extremely difficult to p-dope. There's a huge literature. I mean, gallium nitride, you can only p-dope by using magnesium. That is the only dopant that works. But I will, sorry, I didn't have time to talk about those. I'm very happy well, I'll send all the slides anyway.
What is particularly interesting is, from experimental point of view, there is a huge difference between zinc oxide and gallium nitride. So in gallium nitride, you do have very limited choice, as you have said, it's only magnesium. But zinc oxide, even if you succeed, couple of weeks later, it reverts. So
yeah, and that's consistent with our, I wish I could have got the slides up. That's absolutely consistent with our calculations that say that whole states, in fact, it's part of, you just look at the band structure.
I can look up the paper.
But if you just look at the band structure, the valence band in zinc oxide is really quite deep in energy, the top of the valence band. Top of the valence band, so holes are high energy species. Top of the valence band in gallium nitride is a little bit less low in energy. So what you've just said is completely consistent with the work we've done. But I can follow this up by sending you some of the references.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, good. So I think we the few questions. I have some young colleagues. Edmund, do you have a burning question to ask before I ask Hongjia to do a summary?
Yeah, I'll ask a very quick question. So thank you for a very inspiring talk. So most questions are geared towards the reactions and the calculation. So why not I ask a different question, maybe on the synchrotron, the X-ray experiments. So can I have your opinion and comment on maybe what's the newest development in doing these type of experiments? Are people looking into a higher or faster time scale, or more higher spatial resolution, or can we do maybe the spectroscopy in water so that we can look at maybe electrochemical reactions in addition to gas phase reactions?
Yeah, in fact, all of the above. Improved spatial resolution, improved temporal resolution, variation in the kind of sample you can look at. There's a lot of developments there, and there's certainly the diamond light source. There's going to be increasing investment in those kind of developments for catalytic science. I mean, another technique that I haven't mentioned that has been very much led by my colleague Andy Beale is tomography. He has done some fantastic work there. And that allows you to kind of take a catalytic particle and really map out the composition of this catalytic particle. It's very impressive work. And that, I think, Andy and Bert Weckhausen in Utrecht really have led that field, and it's had a big impact on catalytic science.
Thank you. Thank you for the insight. As an experimentalist, it's really interesting and exciting to hear that there's development in tomography at that time scale and at
have a look at the work of say Beale, Andy Beale and Bert Weckhausen.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you, Edmund. Now I'm sure that there are lots of questions and discussions to be had, but unfortunately we're run quite long already. Nearly we're reaching 6:30. Now, before we close, can I invite Professor Hongjia Sun, our division director, to do a summary. Oh, I forgot to ask you a question. If you have a question, you can still ask as well, Hongjia. Okay. You need to unmute yourself.
I think that
good.
Somehow they line is. No, it's just something wrong with the internet and fairly late, and so Richard, you give very inspiring talk, and from this frontier techniques and simulation, and to those frontier areas, of course, for example, the nitrogen and fixation and also conversion of the carbon dioxide and so on. And so the area again is very broad. You covered from physical chemistry, catalysis, and computational chemistry, and even some analytical chemistry, I believe, in certain of the. And so to demonstrate the modern science, we need interdisciplinary cooperation. Because I noticed then you have an excellent operator on this simulation and on theoretical chemistry, and of course then you use this large facility as a diamond, which is again very important for chemistry and physical chemistry. And so you really give a very nice introduction to the frontier to colleagues in the Faculty of Science, and of course, including Faculty Department of Chemistry. And because it's fairly late already, so I don't want to give too many comments. And finally, please join me to thank Richard again for this very nice talk and excellent talk. And thank you again.
Yeah, I mute and yeah, a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just going to say it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Really enjoyed your questions. And if you've got any more, I'm very happy. Just send them to me by email. I'd be happy to continue the interaction. That's really great. Thanks again, Richard. I hope yeah, you have it hasn't been too strenuous. It's early morning. No, really enjoyable. Okay. Thanks again. Well, interact. I'll thank the panelists. Thank you for your contribution to to the discussion, and also to the audience. We have quite a large number of students and colleagues, friends lobbying from different parts of the world. I thank you all for your interest. As Richard was saying, Professor Catlow was saying, if you have further questions, sorry I could not take all the questions. But if you have further questions and issues you want to discuss, please do email us, and we will just send them by email. We'll do that. Okay, so
bye bye.
Thanks a lot then.
Bye bye now.
Bye.